bringing forward the climate update and deferring kind of the wrap up of the major project estimating to our next meeting. We're going to couple that with electrification and then couple the kind of the wrap up with the ADA ramp modernization kickoff, because they go pretty well together. Because one of the things we're really diving into on the ADA ramp is, you know, how are we estimating? So little tweak in our agenda, and hopefully that is okay. We made a couple of other minor tweaks into the agenda just to align some of the workflows in the department to the topics. So you'll see the changes in blue on the bottom of the agenda. So maybe if we could have the agenda up so we could look at that and see if there's any questions about it. I'm not sure who's sharing right now.
Victoria or Sabrina, can you pull up the agenda? If not, let me know. I can.
Yep, I can pull it up. I thought Victoria was doing it. My bad. Uno momento.
If he's open to that, and some of that was like because of how quickly the slide needed to advance or the animation needed to advance. So I kind of leave it up to Charles about whether it's something he feels like he needs to be doing, or if he can bring number of pieces to advance it. So all that is an option. We should know.
So you can see we put the wrap up of the project estimating in May and ADA ramp modernization. And then in June, the wrap up of the ADA and beginning review of the KPN annual performance report. And then we moved social equity to October, not because it's not important, but because we still haven't finalized our new director of equity. And we thought it was really important to have that person on board when we dive into that conversation. And then also added in November, a chief data officer introduction. We're rolling up that position. And Cooper, remind me, do we have a person on board yet?
We do. For the chief data officer, we have the first one been aboard about 6 weeks maybe. And so they're just getting their feet underneath them. And we thought it'd be a great opportunity to, as they flesh out kind of their vision and get their legs underneath them and understand all the complexity of data within our agency, a great opportunity for them to come and share.
So does anybody have any questions about the tweaks to the agenda? Okay, great. Well, where do we stand on having our team together for the conversation? Susanna, maybe I can check on with you.
Hi, it's Paula. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure you got my message that I'm driving. So I'm going to just listen in and I'll hop in if I have a question.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm going to turn it to Suzanne. Are we ready to go, or how are we doing?
Yep. I'm ready to go.
Suzanne, do you need me to share anything, or are you good?
I think it's up to the committee. I was prepared to speak extemporaneously, but I also have slides if you prefer to sort of see the fancy charts and whatnot as we go, if that's easier to absorb the info.
I always like pictures.
Pictures, let's do it. Okay. Sabrina or Victoria, if you could just see the slide deck that I just sent. And since the network's been down a little bit, sorry that that's sent just now. So anyway, I'm Suzanne Carlson. I'm the director of the climate office here at ODOT. And I have some staff joining me today. Jeff Crook is our policy lead, and Zechariah Heck is our sustainability manager. We may also have Kat Silva, our adaptation program manager, and Tara Widener, our climate impact analysis program lead. She has a conflict, and then I think with the network down, folks are maybe still jumping in. So we understand you like to keep the number of speakers limited, so that's just sort of as questions come up and we have some deeper dive. So today we're going to update the committee on the progress and processes to integrate climate action across ODOT, and specifically talking about applying the climate lens to greenhouse gas investments decisions and assessing ODOT's own carbon footprint. So I'm on slide 2. And as you all know, the foundational direction for this really is the governor's executive order 2004, as well as ODOT's own climate action, strategic action plan to apply greenhouse gas emission standards in making ODOT investment decisions, phasing in lower carbon materials, fuels, and practices, and adjusting investment programs to invest in lower emission projects. For example, biking, walking, and transit. Perfect. We're right up to speed, and I'm going to go to slide 3 here. So starting off with the applying the climate lens decision making phase, this is probably familiar, so I'll go over a little quickly. Phase 1 is bringing information to the Oregon Transportation Commission as they make their decisions. Phase 2, which is underway, is really the internal project selection and narrowing of the STIP. And then our next step will be to report on the data at the what that looks like at the draft and final STIP lists. Next slide. At that phase 1 level to the Oregon Transportation Commission, we looked at outcomes across all of our strategic priorities, which are greenhouse gas mitigation, climate adaptation, congestion relief, social equity, multimodal mobility, safety, and safe good repair. And ideally, we want to meet multiple goals with $1. So where can we find opportunities to do these in the same project and at the same time? Next slide. In our, we did this for the 24-27 STIP cycle and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act with the OTC, looking at investment decisions compared to the need of the system. So in 2020, as you probably recall, we had success increasing multimodal investments by $100 million. And then in winter of this year with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, we again increased investments in multimodal and transport. I don't say we climate office, I said we provide information to a Fortman decision, and the OTC went in the direction to increase investments in multimodal transportation. On the next slide, I'll just note though that the outcome for greenhouse gas mitigation is still the lowest. Basically, we measure against the needs of the system. So even though we're increasing investments, we're not necessarily catching up, or it is slow to catch up. We know that there's unmet needs in each program area, and greenhouse gas mitigation is maybe in the back of that pack, and then multimodal investments as well, coming in at a C- after we made those on the right-hand side there, after making those investments with the hybrid scenario that was selected by the OTC. At this committee's recommendation, we're also applying this lens to the projects being selected for the Infrastructure Act discretionary grants. So that process is in place, it's in progress, and more to come on that. So moving into phase 2, we created a greenhouse gas index methodology to inform the project selection phase, whether programs and projects will increase, decrease, or have no change on greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. So we developed the methodology sort of represented here on the slide, and we assess projects based on how much of their budget is spent on project attributes that could be positive towards climate outcomes like bike lanes, or maybe challenging to greenhouse gas emission outcomes such as roadway widening projects. So sort of bundle all that together and also roll that up into portfolios. So next slide, the goal is not necessarily that project by project. We know projects will move forward for a variety of reasons, but looking for on balance and on the whole, making greener investments. Again, based on this committee's recommendations, last time we met, we worked with ODOT regions on this. So we looked at these results on the greenhouse gas index to their portfolios of proposed projects from the draft 24-27 STIP. I'm on the next slide. I think we're having a little technical hiccup there with the Zoom. And regional staff were encouraged to use the results in 3 ways. Essentially, selecting the most beneficial projects on their list as they narrow it down, changing the scope of existing projects that might improve climate outcomes, and adding funds as needed to improve climate outcomes.
Can I
Additionally,
maybe stop you just for a minute so we can get the slideshow correct? It's a little distracting as we move it around. So I don't know, Sabrina, if you can maybe hit on the home button to your slideshow so we can actually do a slideshow. I'm not sure if what you were given is just a read only. You might have to save it so that you can do slideshow.
Yes, I'm working on it. Give me just a quick second.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to stop things. It's just,
No, that's
it
fine.
was hard for me to follow, looking and trying to listen.
it's dense information as well, so I'll give you a moment to reflect.
And while we're doing that, I might ask you to go back a little bit and
Sure.
explain a little bit more detail, the formula, because you went by that really fast and I'm not sure that I really understood it.
All right. I'm not going to be the formula expert here, but when we get the slides back up, we can take a look
Okay.
at that. So we have, I want to say 23 different possible attributes: bike lanes, signal timing, transit investments, intersection widening, any host of possible attributes, and then the dollar value in it for the sense of scale, how much of the budget is going towards that. And so that's the denominator. Jeff Crook, do you have a layperson comment on how we might explain that as well?
No, I think you pretty much summarized it. It's really about where the dollar is landing across a project for different features of that project. So you might have a bridge that has a bike lane. There could be a paving component. Each one of those elements might score differently, kind of based on the greenhouse gas factors and the amount of money put towards those attributes. So the more complex the project is, the more variables there are. A lot of projects are very simple, where it's just a culvert or just a paving job, and those score very simply. So.
Great, thank you. And I think we're back at it. So
Okay, awesome. And thanks for pausing. Yeah, I'm just sort of pushing through, but now we're all together on the, so just looking at the slide briefly. So the index you see at the bottom there, sort of that spectrum. When we met with the regions, we were able to show, I think that might be a snapshot of it might just be an example. I'm not sure what the snapshot at the bottom there is, but we were able to show a region, okay, you know, on balance, your projects average out to this location on the spectrum. You've got some strongly advancing projects and some more challenging projects. And so going ahead to slide 9, so 2 slides forward from there. Results did vary by projects. I was mentioning that this committee had said, you know, work at the region level and share projects with them. I think I missed one thing I was going to say as well, is that we also did this work with the Enhance group and showed them the projects, and they did pick 3 of the 4 best ranking greenhouse gas emission projects from the Enhance list. At the regional level, you know, results did vary. Not all projects and programs have the same benefits. We did find the highest benefit projects, once we apply that index, are the ITS, Intelligent Transportation System projects, bike ped strategic projects, not surprisingly, and safe routes to school. The ones that are really in that neutral or maybe challenging the goal area were typically fix-it projects. If you think of, let's say, a culvert or a bridge project, you may not have a lot of those other types of attributes available, and those might just be neutral. And then the most challenging scoring projects would be ones that added traffic capacity or makes it more challenging to take a walk, bike, transit mode. So sometimes we had a lot of conversations around intersections, because sometimes you're making an intersection safer, but it might make it more challenging for other modes. So I think that was where some of the conversations happened. And the most variation within the programs was the all roads traffic safety, or ARTS, and operations, meaning they were most likely to have projects that ran the gamut from a more challenging project to a more advancing the goal project. So potentially more selection opportunity within that. And then not all regions really had all those types of projects. So some regions really just had fix it without as much variation. Next slide. So we did have robust conversations with the regions, and we, had some of these lessons learned around successes and barriers. Definitely multiple objectives that they're working under, with this one really being supplemental in terms of being a new lens being applied to the decision making, sort of as the bus is being driven, as it's being built. Results are not final yet, but we're getting pretty close. The 100% lists are due in July. One thing that we're thinking as well is we could add adaptation and green materials to the opportunities. So let's say it's a culvert, there's a great opportunity to increase our climate change adaptation and maybe accommodate flooding conditions there where there maybe isn't a greenhouse gas emission impact necessarily of a new culvert.
Can I just, sorry, this is Shauna. I just want to say, I really like that idea. I think that's a really, it's a criterion that should be measured and valued in the equation, as well as in the materials piece. So it could be, greenhouse gas mitigation, but you could also use materials that are more, for example, more porous, that allow for water to seep through in the case of flooding. Things like that, I think, are really important when we think about adaptation.
Yeah. And again, I think it was, I wasn't necessarily here, but it was sort of in the interest of time. We rolled out as much as we could. And now we're seeing that as we have time to build up an adaptation index as well, that'll be really useful. And data has definitely, Jeff can attest that the data has been challenging. The project list change. We have data from one snapshot in time, and then just difficult to measure. It's such a fluid process working through the STIP selection process. So I'll go quickly over on the next slide, the greenhouse gas inventory of ODOT's own carbon footprint. So again, to our strategic action plan goal, figuring out the emissions that come from our own operations, and then best practices and recommendations available there. This report came out in January of this year, and I mentioned it in the same conversation because we're really seeing similar challenges in terms of the process and the implementation, and the same type of partnership approach. So on the next slide, and this is the one where the PowerPoint comes in handy because you can absorb this better. These are the greenhouse gas emissions by scope. So scope 1 in green is our direct fuel consumption. That's 22% of our emissions. The electricity that we consume from others is scope 2, and that's 8%. And then the orange here is the done by others on our behalf, scope 3, which is our contracted materials and services and the fuel used by contractors. So that's where one of our questions to you today will be around concepts and ideas that might help us through procurement and bidding be able to deploy some of these more progressive materials to get greener outcomes. Next slide. So ODOT is really a leader on the green materials. And this is no longer the low-hanging fruit, really. We've been using 20% supplemental cementous materials over the last 10 years. We've got 30 different products that have been approved over time. And I am now speaking at what I don't even know about, but type IL limestone cement and CSA cements are lower carbon materials that we've gotten approved and are in process right now with industry to deploy those in the right applications, as well as supply is available, getting renewable diesel in use. And so really being able to celebrate these successes is one thing we're hearing internally, is just really recognizing where ODOT is on the spectrum and that it's getting harder essentially. So the recommendations coming out of that plan on the next slide are to continue renewable diesel, work with the contractor industry and material industry on this transition to increase alternative cements, transitioning our fleets to battery electric, obviously. And then there's a new environmental product declaration program, and the legislature provided some support to get that program going over the next couple of years, and then purchasing renewable electricity as well. So we're in the implementation phase with that. The report just came out, and this year will be heavy on implementation. So on the next slide, successes that we've had is just really increasing this transparency, sharing this information, and having these conversations and putting climate outcomes on the table next to other outcomes. We've created some sophisticated tools, as you can see with that, the formula that was hard to comprehend, and engaging across the agency on that and creating these new partnerships. And as we know from Enhanced, that having finished their project selection, 3 of the 4 highest scoring projects were selected. They did also select a lower scoring project. So we're not going to get, as we know, there are other projects will move forward too. And then next slide, and I'm almost done. Barriers in implementation is just that there are so many priorities, and some are really well established, and kind of the way we do business in this climate conversation is a little newer. The color of money can be a restriction. If a region only has this much money for culverts and this much for bridges, what are their opportunities to be flexible and move things around? And what are those funding criteria that brought that project list forward in the first place? Lack of carrots and sticks, as we mentioned in the letter, really, how do we create those incentives to do things differently, or have leverage funds available to plus up where we see a project opportunity and the budget just isn't there. You'll hear next month, as you were supposed to hear this month, more about those cost increases and inflation pressures, which are creating a complex conversation around what do you do when the costs have increased for the work you're trying to deliver. And then on the supply chain is just, are those materials available? Can you get those greener materials in the region close by to where you're building a project? Can you get enough renewable diesel and so forth? And then what's the engagement with industry around that? So with that, and I know I went through probably too quickly and also too long-winded, queuing up our questions on the next slide here. So how do we better measure and celebrate success? How do we make this one ODOT and make sure we're recognizing success and continuing to move forward? And then with the second question, where maybe does the climate office as well as the rest of ODOT focus more? Do we narrow just on where we can have a greater impact? Or do we bring even more parts, more projects, more selection opportunities and range into the conversation and look at other opportunities as well? How do we, and then I think we just briefly discussed adding adaptation and materials and possibility for leverage funds and other funds. And I can potentially pause there. The third question is a little bit in a different direction on contractors. So if we maybe want to open up for conversation on the first 2 concepts first.
I think this is really great. And I think the idea of celebrating successes is very important. And so I would work closely with your comms office and with the state's comms office too. I don't know if that would be at DAS or the governor's office, to really trumpet the successes and trumpet them internally at ODOT as well. Yeah. I think it's important for all the other agencies to know about this, particularly the agencies that you work closely with on climate issues, like I forget who's on the ZEVI-WIG, but DLCD and Odot and DEQ come to mind. On the progress on capital investment climate lens, I think the materials issue is a really interesting one, and one where ODOT can really be a leader and think about other types of materials that could maybe even sequester carbon. And so like think about like including fly ash from coal ponds in cement as one example. So I think that there's other opportunities around materials that you might explore. And then again, just to that point on adaptation, like it'd be really interesting to me if there were climate requirements around culverts or around, around the types of, I don't know anything about culverts, but, the types of vegetation that you plant, if you plant vegetation in culverts. I don't know if you do. I'm really just making myself seem really ignorant right now. But maybe plants that can absorb more water more quickly, or different ways to get rid of wastewater quickly in the event of flooding. Things like that, I think, could be interesting and not add too much additional cost, just sort of redirect cost in a different direction.
Paula, I see you have your hand up. You want to go next?
I do, thank you. I think I really like the idea about touting successes, and I would encourage you to figure out a way to demonstrate the outcomes or the performance with real data. It sounds like you're focusing on that. which is great. But to be able to show measurable successes, examples of tons of carbon removed or whatever, seems like a very good story. I do have a question, and maybe this isn't the right time to ask it, but I'll put it on the table. You mentioned climate adaptation, and I'm wondering, with the focus on climate action as one layer of consideration, how will the other issues like general resilience, either from seismic or climate or other nature-made issues, and then equity, you're going to have all these different frameworks to consider projects and investments from. Have you thought about yet how those are going to layer together and how that decision-making process will work on a project by project or program basis?
Yes, I think we could talk briefly to that. We've done some climate hazard mapping, and we also have some equity overlays to that. So for example, would a disruption be more impactful to an environmental justice community? Kat, Silva, I don't know if you want to speak briefly to some of those intersections there. Kat, I know, has been having trouble, as many of us have, with connection today, so maybe she's not jumping on. So yeah, I think that work is sort of evolving. We are getting ready to issue that adaptation roadmap in July, and we do have some mapping available. So where have the historic climate hazards been in Oregon, and then where are they projected to increase? And then we can also overlay daily travel. So how much disruption is possible to happen if that roadway gets, let's say, washed out. And then, as I mentioned, we can put equity overlays to that and look at more, look at what types of communities are being impacted.
I'm really excited to see this done because nobody else has really figured this out. So you're the guinea pigs. I think you're doing great, but I'm excited to see how it plays out.
And Suzanne, I would just add too that we're also looking at system redundancy as part of how we evaluate impacts. And so if like the importance of a given road, if there's no redundancy, and we know that that there's a high risk there, and also a social equity index community there as well, and we know that there's kind of a higher need to invest in that area to ensure that that roadway, either that we have a redundancy or that that we're reinforcing our roadway to ensure that it withstands the risk a bit better.
Mike, do you want to go next?
Sure. Yeah, I'll echo a lot of what's been said. Congratulations on beginning to embed the thinking into the systemic way you think about the different portfolios and ultimately the projects. I guess I would encourage also to continue to prompt leadership, both at OTC and leadership at the department, to not forget that that your financial structure probably can do as much to incent behavior at different levels, right down to the individual level regarding the transportation system overall. So I appreciate the work on projects, and that is terrific. And but at the macro level, changing the way ODOT and the rest of the system is funded probably can have a huge impact on behavior in this state, right down to the individual. Also, piling on to that a bit, it's a complicated multi-jurisdictional and multi-level responsibility to run the transportation system. And the greater that the different incentives and embedding some of these processes of choosing between projects and between portfolios can get translated to the regional and local level. Also, you can have great influence over how other actors participate when it comes to climate adaptation and impact. So never forget that the example you can set can, I think, put hooks in the system for cities, counties, and regional governments. And then I guess my last comment would be, and I think I've made this comment before, stay focused on where you can have the most impact. A 1% change in mode split in the Portland metropolitan region will have more impact on greenhouse gas than perhaps all the other projects that you do statewide almost. So know where the bang for the buck can be, and stay focused on those things. But congratulations, I think you're
Thanks.
making great progress.
I will mention that we have done this index on the STIP projects. And so there are other ones such as the legislatively mandated ones that have actually
Right.
not come in under this. Yeah, so that is one reason why we mentioned the, where do we shift range, and then the work that we've done indexing some things that are maybe more neutral.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
I agree with all the comments, and I think especially resonating with me is where can we put our efforts to achieve the greatest results? And this is the first try at a measurement tool, which I think is a great start. But as we're evaluating projects and using this tool, do you have any insights as to where we could have the biggest effect? I mean, is it really project selection, or is it, looking internally to our own operations? Is it material selection? I mean, are there really opportunities out there to make a big difference in material selection? I mean, just speak to what you have encountered. Where do we really get the bang for the buck?
So the ODOT materials and fuels is we have a different chart that's got like a big circle of, the driving public, right? And then you've got like kind of materials and fuels come in at a small bullet point within that large circle. And then I think within projects, the ones that are expanding roadway capacity are probably the most challenging. That said, I do think it's really important, and it's in our strategic action plan to make sure we're making that impact with materials and fuels. So it's a little bit of a both and, but in terms of effort level, I think that is one place where we're maybe asking the question of you all, and maybe it punts back to ODOT for our internal knowledge, but do we shift a little bit in terms of what kind of projects are going into this tool and being assessed? I think so. I guess I would say, to the point of being its biggest bang for the buck, it's where there's going to be the most ability to influence travel behavior on that roadway.
Mhm.
I'm so sorry. I'm on my phone, so I can't see if anyone else has their hand raised. Is it okay if I go?
Go for it.
Okay. So PBOT has this interesting like pyramid where they, the top is walking and biking, and then public transit, and then carpooling, or, and they sort of have this hierarchy. And it strikes me that ODOT could have a similar hierarchy when it comes to projects. And for projects that are widening roads and potentially adding more cars or more congestion or more emissions, coming up with some other ways to mitigate emissions, like a pyramid to assess those projects, to say, have we tried the following things before we widen this road? And if we are left with widening the road, what can we do at the very least to mitigate emissions for the materials that are going into this project, acknowledging that we've basically exhausted all other efforts. And I think it's a really interesting, I think Mike mentioned this sort of like interdisciplinary issue where you have multiple government entities and public transit districts, and then you have individuals making individual decisions. Like what are the options for ODOT? ODOT, like what are the arrows in the quiver that you have? And, how do you push people towards what we want them to do, which is to take fewer single occupancy vehicle trips. And one way is to make it really uncomfortable and take a really long time, but that has emissions impacts too, right? Another way is to give them lots of different options. I'll speak just for myself for a moment when I say that, I have a son with myriad disabilities, and we travel in our, internal combustion van all the time. And I am not going, and I know, there's lots of other families in my boat that aren't going to take public transit to the doctor. And so, in my mind, where you go then is you say, we know people are going to be driving in their vehicles. We want them to be electric vehicles. So how do we make it easy for them to drive electric vehicles on our roads? And so then you sort of transition to that electrification conversation.
Yeah. I can take a look at that. I just had a smart thought that went on. Oh, I know what I was gonna say. One opportunity I think could be something like a wetland bank, right? Like a mitigation bank. So maybe there's a project that's not going to have any change, not going to have any impact, doesn't have a budget. Do we have dollars elsewhere that we can plus up a really impactful project? That might be a way to maybe reduce the stress level on each regional manager to think of what their whole portfolio is, and maybe aggregate dollars in a specific direction. And definitely acknowledging that that there's multiple tools, so creating the options, but then also where driving is a good option. Electrifying, that doesn't quite apply here because I think electrification sort of layers on top of these type of projects.
Yeah, I think that's right. I guess what I would just add is what was I going to say? Now I forgot my brilliant thought. I really like the idea of mitigation banks. And I think that figuring out how we might be able to create room in a budget using IJA dollars or other dollars, maybe there's a way to partner with DLCD or DEQ or Odot that have access to some of these funds. Like, how can we start to leverage those? And whether it's statewide or region-wide, I think it's a very compelling. And then what are the projects? You listed offsets on there. What preference do you have for offsets in terms of, like, should they be forestry projects that are in Iowa, or should they be local in Oregon? That's kind of a different kind of mitigation bank.
I'll just clarify that I didn't really go there in terms of doing, like, is it an offset or a sequestration? I think I was still thinking in terms of the attributes we have on our list right now, but that could be something we add to the quiver.
Something, Shauna, you said resonated with me, which is, when we are in the project selection, stage, there's a need to widen the road. Well, have we looked at other options instead of widening a road or adding a road to provide more opportunity? And I think we need to look at how ODOT as an organization identifies needed projects. And my understanding is that it sort of happens at the region level and then kind of filters up. And are we training and embedding that thought process at the local regional level, rather than the first answer being, well, we need a new road, or we need to widen the road?
I would just to build on that, I want to remind everyone that ODOT's sort of core business is construction. And so it would make sense to me that the regions, their gut instinct is to widen a road or do a construction project. And so I think you're absolutely right to, like, if there is a need, if a need is identified at the region level, like, what is that need? Is it actually to widen the road? Or is there like a traffic pattern challenge that we could ameliorate with traffic lights? You know, like what are some different options besides widening the road? And I would bet, I don't know this for a fact, but I would bet that different regions assess need differently.
It's almost like the triple bottom line. You're considering different impacts or issues across decision making on the need of thought process, flow chart.
Hate to say this,
Yes,
Paula,
that's a
but we
project.
can't hear you. You're cutting in and out really badly.
Oh, shoot. Okay, I'll wait.
Sorry. Try it again.
I'm right at a place where I think I switched to a different cell tower. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's better.
Yeah.
Well, my point was going to be that the checklist or thought process, the flow chart, as you're deciding what the needs, you know, if we have a problem on a piece of road, you're considering the climate action impacts, you're considering resilience issues or threats, you're going to think about the equity, and I would caution not to forget about freight movement. So there's all these layers of checklists or thinking that the more you know about a specific location or a problem, it seems like you can do the overlay and have a score or some kind of an assessment in each of these areas to find the best of the best result or investment. Maybe it's additional transit in an area rather than widening. So, I mean,
Yeah.
I think that's a good path. I like the notion.
Yeah, because I think at this point, Suzanne, you've been tasked with, okay, here are the projects. How are we going to score them? And at some point, we need to go kind of further back in the chain. How did we develop the list? And I see, Cooper, you're looking thoughtful. Do you have anything to add?
No, it's just my expression when I'm trying hard to think. It's not an easy task for me. But yeah, I think I really like this conversation, and you know, it resonates with some conversations we've had internally. And in fact, we were on a call earlier today with Suzanne, where we were talking about, I think, the seed of what I'm hearing in this conversation of how do we ensure that these things that we care about are being considered at the earliest stages of our processes, right? And through every stage of the process. So this came up in light of STIP amendments that are coming forward because of you know, IIJA decisions that the commission recently made, and inflation and other things that we're having to adjust certain STIP projects, as you know, Commissioner. And how do we ensure that as we do that, we don't leave on the cutting room floor the elements of projects that are most impactful to climate, that are most impactful to social equity. These are the conversations we're having internally, and I think it's really helpful to hear y'all say it the way you're saying it, because I'll be frank, I don't think we've figured it out on how to. And I think as y'all are pointing out, I think the North Star and where we need to go is baking it into our processes that force it to not be force it to be asked and answered in a way, rather than I mean, we've got to structure our processes in a way, whether it's developing the projects, whether it's amending STIP projects, that force these questions to be asked and answered, or you don't pass go and you don't get to the next stage. And I think that's the piece that we're working on as an agency. And you know, I'll admit, I think when it comes to the work that Suzanne and team have done, it's a really we started with the STIP programs and applying this to 24-27 STIP as a way to get our arms around the impacts of different projects to carbon emissions. And we're in the stage of having to now trickle that down and infuse it in all of our other processes. And, you know, it's not just the climate office that has to do that. It is really all of us as an agency that have to take a hard look at how we're doing that. And climate was the first one out of the gate, but equity is another great example of how do we do this in a very intentional, very deliberate, very structured way that forces us to ask and answer these questions. I wish I had a better answer for you, but I'll tell you, these conversations are what we're having internally. And I think we're driving towards that, but I'll be frank, there's a lot of work to do to build it into the systems that we have, because there's so many, every process is so unique. And they are all predicated on, as I think, Shauna, you said, our culture and our history and our mindset of who we are as an agency, and that we do kind of, our knee jerk is build your way out of things. And that isn't consistent with some of the goals and outcomes that y'all have tasked us with and that we care about as an agency. So I'll shut up, but my thoughts.
Go ahead, Mark. Mike, go ahead. Uh-oh. Are you frozen?
I guess I just wanted to jump in, Sharon, and respond to Cooper. And I really appreciate how hard it is to, I mean, it's one thing to talk about this stuff. It's very much more difficult to embed it in a business process and have the people who are part of that business process internalize the conversation and the outcomes you're looking for. It's a really hard thing to do organizationally. My encouragement, a little bit about what I had said before, and I think maybe when you're having the internal conversation, I guess I would include other big players in the system in that conversation, or you're going to have it again. And so MPOs, for instance, I would consider them an extension of ODOT's discussion about the STIP. They have a certain amount of federal flexible money that they get to make decisions about. So including them in this conversation about how they balance when they make decisions, either about what they're going to try to work with you on or what they think they can do locally. You know, it is a systemic kind of conversation, and including them in it, I think would be really helpful for the Bureau or for the agency. So,
If I can just, Commissioner, real quick, respond to that. I think that's a really great insight, Mike, and it's aligned with kind of what I was thinking as listening to this conversation in terms of as we develop a project list for the STIP, and that's really born out of kind of regional conversations. It goes a little bit to your point about, and I'm thinking about how some of them are developed, at least how I understand it. There's also an element of local advocacy, right? And what they want in terms of the project and the type of project that they want. And so, whereas I think we can, as an agency, explore alternative ways of getting to forcing folks to define what it is the outcome that they're shooting for, and then taking off the table options to really kind of drive towards those outcomes. I think there is a reality that at times there's going to be a disconnect between the expressed outcomes and actually they want it in a certain way, and they want it through an addition of lanes or an interchange improvement or whatever it is, for whatever reason.
That never happens. Come on.
Yeah, so I that's the piece I struggle with, though. And to your point, though, it is, how do we then have that conversation with them, and bring them along as well, and define where we're drawing the line on all of that, and how much say they have versus our say. And of course,
well, we all know that that's exactly what happens in the local conversations at the MPOs, and everybody's out to get what they think is the most important project, or their piece of it, or their share of a pie that's going to get cut up. And there's a lot more than objective criteria that go into that conversation sometimes. But I guess my point is that if you're going to make progress on this, it will be a symbiotic kind of discussion over time, where the agency may be changing incentives or the frame of the conversation that allow locals to begin the conversation in a different place than where they are now. And it's a loose confederation of states that come together to try and protect themselves from everybody else. But if you can change some of the incentives over time, the criteria by which you evaluate things, the criteria by which that framing of the local conversation changes, I just think you're better off trying to bring everybody along. I know it's tough just to do it inside the agency, but we're kind of all in this thing together, and having the conversation more broadly, I think, is an advantage over time.
Go ahead, Shauna.
Just to add to what Mike said, I think that, there are tools that we know are going to help reduce emissions, like public transit. So bringing transit agencies along in those conversations early on, I think is really important as well.
Yeah, I keep coming back to the notion of, having the conversation earlier in the development of a project. And I'm wondering, has Suzanne's department had the opportunity, or is it in the planning stage to have a conversation with the local regions about, here's the lens that we're going to be looking at projects through, how can we as an agency and as a region change how you develop your project so that you are aware of this lens? I don't know if that's an opportunity that we could take.
I've been here 8 months, so I wasn't here when any of these projects, it was a seed in the ground. And I think Jeff is wanting to say something, so I'll just speak briefly, but I think that's absolutely right. That pipeline is probably the 27 to 30 STIP, right? So maybe we'll just temper expectations that the 24 to 27 STIP, which is literally going to OTC in July, has been a bit of a hot potato. How do you take that list and then have the pandemic and the cost and supply chain issues on top of it, and the quick decision making, and then the new lens and change in leadership and so forth and so on, and the development of our tool in real time? Really a lot of factors at play. So we'll have more conversations around how that happens at that planning stage. Jeff, am I right that you had some comments there, or no?
Well, I was going to say that the tool and what we're doing for the STIP is really focused on those ODOT scope and select projects.
Yeah.
But, I think the opportunity is that we have a lot of pass-through funding, right? And so one of the findings just from this phase 2 effort is that it is difficult to try to influence these program by program, a set of funds that's allocated out to the regions and all of their needs specific to those programs. It'd be much easier for us to incorporate climate criterion and that climate prioritization up front, as part of the funding, right? So as projects are part of those lists, climate needs to be integrated into that. And we're just not there yet. It's something that we need to work on, but would, I think, really be an important first step. We're of course doing that at the broader level with our phase 1 work, but as each individual program, like the arts program or operations, or even the Fix-It programs, as they do their lists and they allocate funds out, having climate be part of that equation is going to be really key. And I think it'll save us time and would be, I think, more efficient than what we're trying to do, which is trying to keep up with these lists that are being developed and are constantly changing based on those existing criterion. So hope that made sense.
So what can we do then to have the regions look at their pass-through funds or their projects, or, I'm not sure I understand the whole mechanics of it, but what can we do as an agency to have that lens at the local level implement?
So can I I just want to make an observation. So I feel like things feel really messy right now because you're dealing with all these projects that have already come through the pipeline, and then we're also identifying the need to get upstream in the pipeline. And I feel like we're gonna have to run things in parallel for a little bit, which feels really messy. But in my mind, what that looks like is you have your short, medium, and long-term ideal future states, right? Like you have your short term is what are we going to do with these projects that have already come through the pipeline that are being funded and that may or may not help help our climate goals? What do we do about those? And for those, maybe you have a set of tools like offsets or mitigation banks, or we work with the MPOs around additional funding they might have, or there's different things, but you're looking really short term. The midterm is the projects that are getting developed right now. How can we sort of get in front of those? Can we work with the MPOs or the regions to embed some climate metrics into their thinking now? And then your ideal future state is that before a need is identified, the problem is identified, is articulated, that we have a problem at the intersection of Main and Front. The problem is that there's car accidents. And instead of there being a need identified already, we need additional lanes. We are able to sit around the table and talk about the problem and identify more creative solutions that do have a climate benefit. So in my mind, you've got like those three distinct stages, and in my like little lizard brain, it helps to divide them up because otherwise it gets really swirly.
So I think that's very helpful, Shauna. Really good perspective. In addition, I think along those lines, and to answer your question, Commissioner, what I would say is, I think we're taking a similar approach. So we are looking at, what's the alligator closest to the boat in terms of the projects that are coming through with the IIJA. And I'd look to Suzanne and others on the team to correct me if I'm getting this wrong. But my understanding is we're applying a climate lens and equity and other lenses in a more intentional and deliberate way for the ones that are closest. And so we started that with the 24-27 STIP that you all approved whenever that was last year, I recall, Commissioner. And then we're making sure that now the near term target is how do we, as we amend STIPs, how do we make sure, to my previous point, we're not leaving on the cutting room floor the elements that move the needle in these spaces. And so intentionally, deliberately, how are we applying these criteria there? How are we applying some metrics? And then how are we, as we have IIJA funds come on board and projects that are coming through that work, how are we making sure that the climate lens is being applied there? Meanwhile, and I think a little bit to your point, Shauna, we are, I hope I didn't make it sound like we weren't as an agency doing this, because we are, but we just haven't landed it yet, trying to move downstream in the process, to your point, Commissioner, and have these metrics baked into our processes starting at the regional level. I don't think we're going to get there until we get closer to the next STIP cycle, and we've kind of identified that as the mark on the wall for us. Because it is a 3-year cycle, recall, and it takes a little bit of time to do this well and to do this intentionally. And so our goal is, when the next STIP cycle comes to you as the commission and y'all approve it, y'all will see that not only did we apply these lenses at the last or the near last steps like we did in the 24-27 STIP, but that we applied it from the get-go, from the early stages of development. And so I think that's our goal. But we haven't landed how we're applying it yet, because we're just not there in the STIP cycle, and we're focused on making sure that these lenses are applied to IIJA money coming in and the changes that causes to our projects and the like. And I mean, just to be frank, we have to kind of take small bites of this because it is a huge Herculean effort, as I'm sure Suzanne and the team can attest to better than I can.
Yeah. I think and Jeff knows up close how much work it is to put all these projects through the lens. I think I'll just ask a couple more questions. Well, one would be on our question number 3 there, knowing that we've got some great expertise in this room, if you've got thoughts around sort of that contractor piece and how we work with them to You know, if we've got X dollars on a project and we know there's a markup on certain kind of material, what are some thoughts around incentives on the material side? And then I guess I think thinking of existing projects, are there additional, oh, I know what I was gonna say, sort of that color of money question. How do we move money between buckets? Because that's maybe one of our more near-term thoughts as well. And maybe this will come forward more in your next conversation around cost estimating and how we address that. But maybe be thinking of some of those limitations that we have too around being able to move dollars.
Go ahead, Ted.
All right. One of the big problems we have is that materials have to be pre-approved by the state before contractors can use them. So as we get new materials out there, a lot of times contractors will see them, but to get them approved. So ODOT needs to take a hard look at finding a way to look at materials, get a list in a much faster way, or even prior to bid, as it could be done. You know, the specifications pretty much limit what we can do on these things. I think contractors are pretty good at finding better ways and areas that they can save money at, save time, and look at. You know, we've been doing things for the environment for a project I ever did on Fish and Game, and we took pictures of where we were and we asked, how do we make this better when we leave? We did that because we had to work Fish and Game on a project, and we wanted them to know we were the good guys. We'd work with them, we'd make things well, and it helped. So I think it's just more hand in hand with contractors and with finding ways to make changes that can be done rather than being stifled by a set of specifications, or if there is new materials that can be used, better materials that we just get to because of the processes.
A question out of pure ignorance. Does the agency have a ongoing contractor group that you meet with to regularly to start to talk about some of these issues in a more kind of policy level way?
We do. Yes.
Okay. Because I think this is a partnership. You can't set material standards or even design standards in such a way that nobody can meet them, or it's a huge extra cost or whatever. So to me, this is kind of a collaborative effort, even to the point of thinking about how can you structure your contracts in a way that provide different kinds of incentives that will actually help contractors figure out how they're going to meet some of these goals that you'd like them to meet, whether it's through their own equipment or its materials or whatever. And then the issue of equipment has been one for forever, I think. And the issue of capitalizing new equipment or change outs of equipment is a huge issue for a lot of folks. And especially when you're trying to get MWSB folks on your jobs. And so having a conversation around how can the agency be more, targeted, if you will, about changing the market that contractors have to work within, whether it's around equipment or materials, I think would be, and maybe those things are already going on, Ted, but it just seems to me this is a partnership at the end of the day. If you're trying to have an impact on climate goals, and you've got to figure out how to work together on it. So,
and it gets a little touchy because we have disadvantaged business goals that we're trying to meet.
Right.
If we start, you got to have a brand new piece of equipment, it costs you 100 times what your project is, and you have a chance to use it, it hurts. So there's a lot of steps that we have to go through to make this all work. I think it's workable, but we need to do it not in big leaps, but in small steps to bring everybody along.
Mhm.
I think what we're doing is great here, and we need to keep thinking outside the box. We can't go back to just doing it the way we've always done it. Change things. So the changes have to come along, but we can't create a big bureaucracy either that just stops everything in trying to find answers. We've got to work it and think about it and be flexible and make it happen as we go through it.
So this is a bit in the weeds, and I don't know much about this, but apparently if we require certain well, maybe requires not the right word. If we desire a certain material, the vendor would create, let's say, a huge batch of it that wouldn't all go to ODOT. So I know that's a constraint as well, as we don't really require the specific mix, we just sort of allow for it. And they may not be able to get the cost increase for the full batch, if I'm representing that right.
Well, I think if you're talking about like asphalt or concrete, you get those suppliers in talk about, is that viable to get it out to bid? And if it is, fine. Single sourcing materials, always tough. So if ODOT, this is what you're going to use, that's the only thing you can use. And the contractors all bid it in, and go out, whoever gets a job does it, and it fails, it goes back on ODOT, not on to the supplier or anybody. I mean, a single source material. So there's a risk to that too. And that's why you got to involve multiple companies. There's a lot of little tricky things that have to go to that we can work through, but we really think about it and not on top of things because we think it's a great idea, and then it backfires and hurts us in the long run.
Thanks.
I have a question. To that point that you just made, Suzanne, is there a way for us? Government agencies don't have the same like antitrust issues. So like ODOT could join with like WashDOT and say we're only going to purchase certain kinds of low carbon asphalt or cement. Is that right? And sort of make it a little bit easier, like sort of send a message to the market that there's going to be a demand for this, and so you'll be able to offload it if necessary. We're not just the only ones buying it.
That's possible to do, but you've got to work with the suppliers to make sure they can get the material that you're requiring, that it's out there, that they can sell it. And all the ready mix plants have an opportunity to purchase the material and get it out. It's not just sole source.
Right.
And
Of
we've
course.
done that in the past. We did it with the alt, and I'm missing the name of it, but it allowed all the water to go through it. So we had no standing water. Unfortunately, all that asphalt peeled up and we had the worst highways we ever saw. But we changed and it did work. We took it out and replaced it. So again, it's a process that you got to work through.
You still have your hand up, or you have another point?
Oh, just one more question. We can also join with local bureaus of transportation, right? Like with PBOT around procuring different types of inputs for the transportation system, right?
Yeah, PBOT follows what
Got it. I guess my point just is I guess, is that always the case? Do local bureaus of transportation always follow what the state does, or is that just their decision to do that?
They tend to follow because they follow ODOT specs and they use them for bidding project. But they do have special provisions and they'll bring in special materials on, depending on the project. So it's a bit of a mixed bag.
Okay, I was just thinking about different ways to increase our buying power and use, like different agencies to use that could purchase a given material.
And that's all doable.
I would think though that you want to watch the research very carefully to see where you're going to get the biggest bang for the buck on some of these alternative materials. TRB does a lot of work in that area with research projects. We talked about what's going to get the best results for a climate action. I am curious, and I doubt that the materials end of things is going to really move the dial as much as we might hope.
That's really helpful. And yeah, I'll mention that we have engaged industry throughout the process with writing the report, making sure we have buy-in. And so I'll be curious to learn more about what those tables are that we can make sure we're at and come up with creative solutions. Because what we found was that the will is there, the interest is there, all the partners are willing, and it's sort of working out the logistics to get there.
Great. I think we're getting close to the end of our time frame. We want to do a 5-minute wrap up at the end, but is there any other burning things people want to say, or Suzanne, anything we haven't kind of answered or talked about that you want to explore?
I'll just say this is a great conversation. It's great to have so many high-powered minds. We feel like we're just operating here day to day with our little small but mighty 10-person team, and how do we embed this thinking throughout the agency? So it's super helpful. And then just seeing Kat there, I think I'll make a plug that, of course, adaptation is forthcoming as well. How do materials also help with adaptation? How does the climate index also start pushing in the adaptation direction is going to be really important. So I just really appreciate the time and the focus today. And I know we stole 45 minutes back from the other group, so we made use of it.
No, thank you. And it was great presentation, and you're definitely moving the needle, but it's a heavy lift and
Appreciate
complicated. So, but great work. Thank you.
Thanks
and
so much.
maybe Cooper, do you want to wrap us up?
Sure, happy to. I guess I would just say thanks, Suzanne, Kat, Jeff, Zachariah, who else am I forgetting here? But y'all do have a tremendous team, and I think it's reflected in conversation today. So they're doing a lot for our agency. Thank you for presenting and giving us your time and perspective on this as a committee. A couple of things I want to take away. I really appreciate everybody's perspective on this. This was really enlightening to hear other voices and other minds outside of the ones that are typically around our tables when we're talking about these things. The items that I think are due for some follow-up and that we'll certainly as a team go back and explore further, among others, is really the questions that are echoing in my mind are, where do we get the biggest return on our investment, the biggest bang for the buck, and how are we, doling out our limited resources with that in mind. And then I really like the idea of the wetland banking or some other offsetting options. That seems like something that's worth exploration. And then just because this conversation has highlighted it for me, I want to go back and understand where we are in driving our process back to kind of the origins in terms of STIP development and other things. And I know the team's working on that, and we just didn't have time to get into details, but it does make me realize that even though we're on a 3-year STIP cycle, that needs to be happening in the early phases now. So, and I think it might be. So all of great questions and thoughts, and we're going to go back and do some more thinking and look forward to coming back at some point if y'all want to have an update on what we're doing here. But shifting gears to next time, I think May 18th is our next meeting. And Commissioner, as you said, we'll have on the agenda electrification. I think Amanda is going to be leading that conversation, but maybe with some others from the climate team and elsewhere. And then we'll also talk about continue that major project estimating and ADA estimating conversation. So excited to see y'all all then. That's my 2 cents, Commissioner, and back to you.
Great, thanks, everyone. I really appreciate all your time and insights, and we'll see if we can't get another member of our team on board as soon as possible and keep plowing ahead. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thanks.